Good morning. Good morning. Wow. As you can see, it's certainly impromptu. I wasn't actually planning on doing a stream here. Hello, Aardvark. Got Aardvark in the chat. Thanks for joining us. So the whole point of this stream is I've been seeing a lot of, shall we say, interesting takes on history lately. And by lately, I could probably span this back multiple years. And I feel like this is something I can address and hopefully help bring some understanding to people, because I think there's a drastic misunderstanding of what history is. So first things first, I think we only have one person watching right now. Whatever. As I said, this is an impromptu video. I kind of decided to do this very last minute. So if anyone joins us, full disclaimer, I'm not going to really be paying too much attention to the comments because this is a pretty focused thing, and I don't even know how long I'll be on here, to be frank, because I got some stuff to take care of today. But after seeing like the up-tillionth one of these posts and what have you, I felt like this was something that I needed to talk about. So, what is history? Now, before we answer that question, I'm gonna share something here real quick. I'm gonna share a screen here to an image. That's one of like the big points of why I am doing this video. And give me a second. Sorry, I apparently closed out of it. So, as I said, this is early for me. I don't usually stream at this point in time. So Ted Layman's in the chat saying preach. Is like, yeah, it's time to talk. So I want to share this. All right. Why isn't it called herstory? And the comment up at the top here kind of covers the basics of it. But let's talk about this, because I've been seeing a lot of posts lately, not necessarily in this vein, but like, talking about things like, American history and being like, oh, how it's taught versus how it really is. And you got pictures of Superman and Homelander being thrown out there. And I really think that this is just creating a disingenuous discussion. Don't get me wrong. There are problems with how history is taught. And I'll even address those in this video. I will talk about how we have failed in teaching history, because I think that really ties into the big problem here. And it all stems from shit like this. Why isn't it called herstory? So the assumption here is, and I'm going to take this down. The assumption here is that history is meant to be his story. And what this does is this codifies prejudice in the human narrative effectively, right? Like that's the whole point, is to showcase that, oh, it's a sexist story. We don't talk about the woman's story at all, and this, that, the other. And, if there were a way to throw in more check marks into this, I'm sure people would. But this all comes from a massive, massive misunderstanding of what history is. So what is history? Well, let's look at the word itself. Where do we get Oh my God, Neff is in the chat. Let's see what we can get Odin to say today. So far, codified prejudice seems to be a good place to start. Anyways, um, so the word history, where does it come from? Well, the word history comes from a Greek word, historiai, which is which means inquiry or inquiries. The first, if you will, history book was written by the person that we credit as the father of history. I say credit because obviously, he's what formed what we understand of like Western civilization's history and what have you. He's like the first real primary source that we have in topic. Oh my God, I can just see his train of thought. Yeah, you suck, Neff. I've got ADD, ADHD, so it's like one of those things. But what Herodotus did with his histories is that he traveled around the region of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean to inquire about the stories of those collective peoples, because he was trying to bring context to probably the most significant event of his lifetime. He did not participate in it, but he was a child when Athens was sacked by the Persians in the Second Persian War. He did participate in the Peloponnesian War, and he writes on that as well later. But the whole point of his initial histories was to analyze and contextualize the conflict between Greece and Persia, because, and in no small way, this affected every Western civilization. The conflict between Greece and Persia and the Greek victory over Persia would set up Greek dominance and of the region for the next several centuries, all the way through, obviously, Alexander the Great as the Macedonian king who became hegemon of Greece and eventually king of Persia, and a list of titles that I'm not going to go on because we can spend like literally 2 minutes going through them. But the point is that Herodotus went on to ask questions. And at the beginning of his inquiries, he prefaces this in an introduction. This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man may not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by the Hellenes, some by the barbarians, the Persians, not lose their glory, including, among others, what was the cause of their waging war on each other. This was the purpose. And this is at the core what history is about. History is not arithmetic. It's not memorizing formulas and getting an exact answer. It's not definite. It's looking through a massive microscope with thousands of different lenses, some of which we don't even have access to. And I'll get to that here in a little. And trying to piece together the story. Herodotus, in his works, even goes on to say, you have to believe these stories, because what other choice do we have? Like, even though they can come off as overly melodramatic and crazy, what other choice do we have? These are the stories that have been passed down. These stories that Herodotus has no way to verify outside of what he is told. And this becomes a point of contention for later historians as far as the accuracy of Herodotus. Even among his contemporaries, his major opponent is another historian, Thucydides, who's way more about trying to verify the stories as well. And he has a more modern historiographic approach to history. But like what it all comes down to is questions. It's about asking questions, which leads to, things like, oh, well, how like, we're just sensationalizing our generations to be overly patriotic and this, that, the other, and how history is taught in school. And there's some merit to that. I feel that no country that has ever existed that is educating their populace is going to do so in a way where the up and coming populace is set to disdain the nation. And to that effect, I think that the current approach has become dated so that when people are approached with the nuance of history, where things get gray, where things get murky, it's no longer about, well, what good or bad happened. It's just those people just focus on these dark elements. And so as a result, you go from romanticizing your country and its history to demonizing it. But that's never the intent of history. The intent of history is to create a better understanding through rational lines of questions. It's about looking through primary sources from various different spectrums and seeing where they meet, seeing what can be backed up, what's consistent between the two, what can be backed up by modern archaeology, what can be backed up by a whole number of different things. And it's not so simple as good or bad. So, like, for instance, let's look at American history, because this is one of like the big hot buttons, because obviously, we like everyone here in the chat so far lives in the United States, I believe. And so when you're looking at American history, there's a lot of really good things and there's a lot of really bad. There's no sugarcoating it. No nation state is formed or comes to prominence without crossing ethical boundaries. And that's not to dismiss the wrong that has happened. That's not to disregard the bad that has happened, but to only focus on those elements, to only focus on those negatives is disingenuous. Because while this country has had its very, very long list of transgressions, it's also been a pioneer of a lot of positive forces in the world. Probably one of the biggest hot button topics when it comes down to American history is obviously the slave trade. So let's talk about America and the slave trade. So first off, during the transatlantic slave trade, the North American continent of the United States had the least amount of slaves coming to it. And the slaves that came to the United States received better treatment than the slaves of the Caribbean, and especially the slaves of countries like Brazil in South America. And that plays a big factor into why there were not as many in the United States. They were living longer. Hojo is in the chat. Welcome, Hojo. He's saying, as a descendant of Native Americans, I'm sick of people saying give back stolen lands. To which ones the tribes conquered and enslaved each other long before the first boats touched each other. And that's another issue. And I think that the other big thing is like, give back the stolen lands to who? Because unfortunately, and this is one of those darker moments in our country, a lot of the tribes that you're trying to quote unquote give back stolen lands to, they don't exist anymore. They were wiped out. The East Coast tribes especially are pretty much non-existent. Like, there are some vestiges in communities left, but they're not a lot. And we don't know how long they'll be around. Like, just full stop. It is what it is. It's an unfortunate reality, but it's a part of the history. It's a part of the story. It's a part of what happened. And it's not something that should be glossed over. It's not something that should be ignored, but it's something that needs to be understood. And part of understanding is recognizing what's right and what's wrong about it, and hopefully learning the lesson of why this can't happen again, why we should be endeavoring to do better, because that's really what it's all about, right? You know, everyone spits out the idiom, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat its mistakes. And there's a truth to that. When you look at history, it's very clear that human beings are cyclical. They repeat patterns. You have political scientists as far back as the antiquities talking about revolutionary cycles of government. Probably one of the most prominent ones from back in the day was done by a guy named Polybius, called anacyclosis, which, you know, modern people have kind of simplified into an idiom. You know, strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men. It's oversimplified, but like, that's the crux of it. So we are very cyclical beings, and the best way to throw a wrench in the cycle, or at least keep the cycle at a position where it's favorable to the present, is by understanding what went wrong and what went right. So going back to slavery in the Americas, you know, America gets a lot of shade because, oh man, you guys didn't fully abolish slavery till the 1860s. Well, after everyone in Europe. Well, let's take a look at that, because that's not entirely genuine. By if I can talk, 1780, Pennsylvania is the first state to fully abolish slavery. In other words, the first autonomously governed entity, because 1780, we're talking right after the American Revolution. I believe we're still in the article. We still are either in the Articles of Confederation or have just signed the Constitution. States are self-governed effectively. We have a federal government, but the states run themselves. So the first autonomous entity to abolish slavery is in America, is in the United States. 1783, Massachusetts follows suit. By 1807, we had a federal passing of legislation in 1787 that prevented the practice of slavery in the Northwest Ohio River Valley territories. And we have by 1807, most of the northern states had already abolish slavery or were in the middle of passing it in legislation. So why is 1807 important? Well, the first European nation to abolish slavery is England in 1807. Now, Hojo brings up slavery is not an American institution. It was imported by the British and ended by a Republican. So this can be a bit, right. This isn't particular. This also isn't 100% genuine either. First off, let's address the big thing in the room. Ended by a Republican. Political parties have been shifting in their dynamics forever. I'm blanking on the exact year that it initially happened, but effectively, what ended up happening is you had a political party that was trying to swing middle of the road votes. And so they put up a candidate as their head of their party that better reflected what the other side was. But then eventually, since that person becomes the soapbox of the party, the dynamics start to switch, views begin. The Republican Party of the 19th century is not the same Republican Party as it is now. Republican Party as it stands now is way more on small government and state autonomy and everything like that. Republican Party of Lincoln's era was an institution that favored very heavy big government and everything. It was effectively the successor to Hamilton's Federalist Party. So as I said, trying to use those labels, like it's party dynamic shift all the time. And that's a whole other discussion that I can do in a whole different video. If people like the history content, I can definitely see if I can't do more of these. I can talk about this stuff all the time, and I'm more than happy to do some extra research to do more focused topics. But moving back to this is, he also said slavery is not an American institution. It was imported by the British. That is correct. However, it built the foundations of specifically the Southern colonies economically, and they were heavily reliant on them. The Northern colonies, not so much. Slave trade up past Pennsylvania was pretty nominal, even in the earliest days of colonialism, because there wasn't any really farmland to till. The majority of the trade there was mercantile and textile. So slavery really only played a massive role in the Southern colonies, where you had large-scale plantations, and they weren't willing to get rid of slavery because obviously the alternative is you pay for hired work, and they were concerned about their bottom line. And that's a whole other discussion, as I said. But the American economy of the Southern states was built upon the foundation of the transatlantic slave trade and African slaves. Yes, there were a lot of indentured European workers that came in, and I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Maybe I can do a video on that, because there were a lot of people that came over that were indentured servants, and what happened to them was equally messed up. But at the end of the day, a lot of those people were able to, a good chunk of those people were also able to work long enough to fulfill their financial transgressions and move past it. You weren't necessarily going to get that on the other end of the spectrum. And so I get why people focus on this, because there have been a lot of things that have come about as a result, a lot of tensions, a lot of poor relationships in the country between different cultures, different races. And a lot of it stems back to this initial issue of people coming over here as property. Now, this is where you go and we have to look at the nuance here. Because as we said, the Southern was built on this economy that ran off a very questionable practice that, especially post-Enlightenment, was a issue of debate. The initial draft of the Declaration of Independence labeled slavery as an impunity forced upon the colonies by the British, which is ironic considering that Jefferson maintained his slaves throughout on Monticello throughout the remainder of his life. But the point is that it was a major point of contention. Is once you had the Enlightenment and you had these people kind of talking about what is humanity and human values and really focusing on ethics, it became this whole question of, can we even have? It's like, is slavery even morally correct? And you had people arguing on both sides. And in the United States, you see that come to fruition faster than it does in the Enlightenment's point of origin. And so to sit here and talk about, oh, well, we had slaves through, we were one of the last countries to still have slaves. Well, slave trade had been pretty much abolished in most places in the United States by the time of the Civil War. Importation of slaves had died down, had gone away because the East India Trading Company no longer existed. It got dissolved. They were no longer running the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not like we had more people coming in. And it was literally just a portion of the so Aardvark saying there were never any African slaves on the island of Great Britain in the era. Plus, all European colonies had slaves. The Iberian and French colonies were far worse. Britain was the leading force of abolitionism. I agree and disagree. The first country to abolish slaves was Haiti, and they abolished it because of the revolutionary values that were inspired by the French Revolution. And while Britain was the first country to officially get rid of slavery, France was very close behind, and they really there was a lot of equality being for all the French Revolution's faults. One of the big things that they really were trying to push during the French Revolution was were the concepts of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, right? It didn't go that way forever. It became a massive mess. We have Creators Outlet, William Pace, joining us in the chat. Thank you so much. But yeah, when it comes down to America, we had this institution. We had it for a long time, yes, as a whole, but the majority of the country was slave-free. States in the northern part of the colonies had passed legislation to make it to abolish it before even England had gotten rid of slavery. And we had passed legislation to prevent slavery from being in some of the most economically viable territories in the West as we were expanding west of the Ohio River Valley, which covered 6 states six present-day states. We have Walter Leva has joined the chat. Hello, Walter. And so to sit here and talk about how bad we are because of having this institution, when at the same time we were also one of the pioneering forces of getting rid of that institution and what have you, is, I think, disingenuous. because you take away from the efforts, active efforts made by statesmen of their era that fought hard to get rid of this practice and vocally spoke out against it. So you cannot just go and label something as, well, we're taught that we were all good, but in all actuality, we're just evil. No. And both things are wrong, by the way. Pushing America as a paragon that can do no wrong is wrong. And I think that a lot of that has backfired as information has become more freely available and people effectively become better historians than what they're taught to be by just Googling shit on their phone. Because that's ultimately what history is really about. To bring this back is inquiry. It's question seeking. It's going and looking through primary sources. It's trying to find the answers and trying to create a better picture, a better understanding of what happened. Because at the end of the day, you weren't there. And you can sit here and you can analyze and you can do everything. But at the end of the day, all this is going to be a murky picture. I mean, and the farther you go back, the murkier that picture gets. You know, when you like, my focus as a historian is in the antiquities. I look at a lot of, Hellenistic era Greece, Golden Age Greece, Bronze Age era, and the history of the Roman Empire. That's my shit. But one of the biggest things that's a massive punch to the gut is the primary sources that I have on some of these things. Like, I'm a huge Alexander the Great fan. The major primary source that we have on Alexander from like the Greek perspective isn't really even a primary source. It's a tertiary source. It's like it is a third source, or maybe even a secondary source. Because what it is it's a guy that wrote a biography that takes in account three primary sources of generals who served with Alexander and compiles them into a consistent narrative, trying to effectively do like averages between the casualty counts that each of these people give, and try to really capture the truth about Alexander. But the crazy thing is that all three of those primary sources that this guy used to write his biography of Alexander don't exist anymore. We don't have them. They were lost. So the further that we go back, the greater a chance that we have of the record being gone. There are a few people in here that know that I've just submitted a piece for peer review on Hadrian's reductionism, and it's all focused on his time in Britain, because there's this massive hole in the primary sources about this time in Britain. And there are so many things that tie back to it. And so it kind of feels like there's a massive conspiracy to like not talk about it. And while it's a compelling paper, and while I think that I do my research well, I am sure that they're going to be that when they go through the peer review process, the first question is going to be is like, well, what if those primary sources just aren't there anymore? What if we've lost them? What if the reason why you can't find any of that stuff is because it was written in another document and we don't have it? And I can't account for that. And that's what that's what this whole process is. What is so interesting about it is that it's an analytical process. It's going through and asking questions. And this goes into how we failed at teaching history And I can't speak to in other countries. I can only speak to how I grew up. We have failed. In my time growing up, there is only one teacher that taught history the way that it should be taught. And that's not to say that the rest of my teachers were bad teachers or bad people or anything like that, because they all did a very good job doing what the board wants them to do, because there's the Board of Education has a history standard, right? Like, this is standardized education. This is how they want things to be pushed. And to a degree, I understand needing that to give a foundation, a backbone. But the concept of history as a memorization contest of give me what happened on this date, tell me who this guy was, and this, that, the other. Like, history is not a trivia game. That's not the point. I could care less. If I was a history teacher, I could care less if the student was able to tell me the exact dates of an event, so much as explain to me what happened during the event, how it affected the world around it. History doesn't take place in a vacuum. It has consequences, and it's played off. It's played off of by the things that happen around it. There's nothing that happens free of the environment that it exists in. So if you can sit here and tell me how the social and political status quo of the time affected this event, and how and why it happened that way, and what the effects of that event were, I could give a damn if you tell me what the dates are, because that's something that you can look up. I don't care about that. But if you can tell me without having to look it up what those aspects were, then you know it, you understand it. You've made the inquiry, you've asked the questions. And that's what history should be about. And that's how we've failed, is we've turned history into a glorified trivia contest. And yeah, there's especially when they're kids, we're trying to instill a positive outlook so that the kids can hope for better. But there comes a point where you kind of have to take the kitty gloves off. Because if you continue to push we do nothing wrong kind of mentality, as they become older and disillusioned, all you are going to do is create what we have right now, which are a bunch of people that, they either hold to the initial we're good and we can do no wrong, or they hold to the we're evil and there's no redeemable qualities to us as a nation. And both ways of looking at it are wrong. I am currently wearing like a Roman history joke t-shirt. I love Roman history. I love the Roman Empire. I frequently joke about how things would be better if Rome was still around. But I'm not unaware of the wrong things those guys did, because they did. Julius Caesar is one of my favorite characters in human history. If Julius Caesar did what he did today, he would be in front of a war tribunal. There's a whole 6-hour podcast by Dan Carlin called Celtic Holocaust, which is all about Caesar's Gallic Wars and how what Caesar did there puts what the United States did to the Native Americans to shame. The Native American massacre is nothing. And what's even more tragic is that the technological differences between the two were slim enough where the Celts actually had a chance and they almost overcame it. But the Roman military machine, that precise military training and their engineering and their ingenuity on the battlefield gave them this unconquerable edge at the end. And so it didn't matter. It's important to recognize what went wrong, what the faults were. It's part of, when you have people talking about the American flag and you're talking about the symbolism between each of the elements, right? The blood of the red, the blood of the people whose lives were shed in the formation of the country. At least to me, it's not just about the soldiers who gave their lives to protect the country. It's every person who died to get us here. It's every person. And it's not just those who died honorably on our side. It's the Native Americans that we had to that we pushed off of their territory in the Indian Wars and the massacres that happened there. It's the slaves that helped build the southern colonies that died from exhaustion and being overworked. It's everything. It's not just about glorifying the good. It's about recognizing the cost. Because no nation state from present till the beginnings of history was built without crossing ethical lines. Every single country, every single nation committed atrocities to establish themselves. And that's not to say, oh, well, that doesn't matter, or that it doesn't matter that these things happen. It absolutely does. It's part of why we need to continue asking the questions. We need to continue to understand the story and understand what happened and bring that context to a modern lens that can take account all of these different primary sources that we find or have found. But to sit here and say that a country is bad solely because of the bad things it did to get to the present, and that it has no redeemable quality, and that because we don't live up to the Superman, we're Homelander, it's wrong. It's more nuanced than that. And I get that it's a joke. Like, I understand memes like that. They're a joke that are trying to put a bit of real world commentary on things. I understand that. But it's a dangerous thing. It really is. Because while it might be a joke to you or me, there is somebody that is going to read that and go, man, he's 100% right. And the fact of the matter is that it's not. And the moment that you create that understanding, or rather misunderstanding, that because we're not paragons of good, we are pariahs of evil, you are creating a dangerous, dangerous precedent. No nation is without its faults in its story and its collective origin. Every nation has done fucked up things to be where they are now. Every single one of them. It's part of establishing that. There's always going to be someone that gets screwed. The question is how do we look at those things and learn from them? The exception to the rule being here, Froggy put it in the comment, Carthago delenda est. Absolutely. Ceterum censo delenda esse Carthago is a truth. It's noble truth. But in all seriousness, Punic Wars and other big things, like, Carthage and Rome, they had this massive rivalry, and Carthage, gets completely destroyed. And Rome salts the earth. Now, there are a lot of modern historians that try to say, oh, well, they didn't actually do that. But I've read the descriptions of what Carthage used to look like. Tunisia does not look that way anymore, buddy. Like, shit happened. And what are the widespread effects of something that brutal being done? Like, at the end of the day, there are consequences to those things. It's about understanding these elements. And to be an effective person that wants to commit lasting change on a sometimes irrationally unfair world, you need to understand the nuance, and you need to understand that just because a country or a person does something wrong one day doesn't mean that they aren't capable of a greater good. Every single person here that I know has gotten to know me because I'm a comic book creator. I write stories. I grew up loving the Iliad, and I grew up loving comic books and superheroes. The whole point of characters like Superman, Steve Rogers, Captain America, all of those characters is understanding that people are not perfect and that people can become misguided and do wrong things, but that people, all in all, are worth saving because deep down inside of us, we have an untapped potential for good. And when we unlock that potential and we come together, we can do great things. We can build coliseums. We can build pyramids. We can build a country that runs on its own and has a governing system that's so ridiculously complex and ahead of its time that the foundations of it are still kept in relative tact, despite being so quote unquote out of date. We can build a better tomorrow, but the key to doing this is asking the questions, making the inquiries, so that you can get a better understanding of what happened in the past. And it's not about his story. It's not about her story, because that's irrelevant. History isn't that. It's about asking questions. And you get both sides when you ask questions. You get both his story and you get both her story. And his story, in history, it was never meant to exclude one or the other. It was about capitalizing on the fact that when we ask questions, we can gain better perspective. Look at what happened to the Greeks during that period. They became the prominent culture in the world. They created a military that would eventually go on to rival and conquer the dominant superpower of the ancient world. There is an argument to be made that Alexander the Great could have genuinely conquered Asia if he didn't die by 30. But that's what it all comes down to, is when you have an understanding. When you have an understanding of the things that came before, regardless of whose perspective, when you take into account all of those perspectives and you apply them through the microscopic lenses of inquiry, you get an understanding of the past that allows you to forge a better tomorrow. So that wraps up what I wanted to talk about with this. I feel like doing a lot of shilling and everything is kind of poor form. We do have, I'm closing down the SPQR campaign on Friday. We're very close to 10K. So if you haven't supported that and you want to, please feel free, obviously, share the link around. If you can back, please go on ahead. I'm certainly not going to complain. And we do have the sign up for the Embrace too, but I'm not going to go out of my way to like pull up those pages or anything right now. Thanks, Frog. Frog's got the links there in the chat. If you guys do really like this video and you want to see more content like this, obviously, like, leave a comment, do whatever. And I'll see if I can't make some more time in my schedule to do these. But this was just something that, after seeing a whole bunch of these kinds of posts, I couldn't just sit there and look at it and not say anything anymore, because I feel like it's not fair. It's not genuine to the actual facts. And if we are to be a better country, we need to have an honest discussion about it. And part of that is acknowledging that we've done some great things, and part of that is acknowledging that we've really dropped the ball on some others. But anyways, thanks so much for coming to hang out. We have 4 people in the chat right now, so thanks so much again. And we will catch you here in a bit. Brews and Reviews this Friday. It's probably going to be pushed back to next week, frankly, because I've got the closeout on Friday, and I had to go in to they're having me come into work an emergency shift because they had an opening on the schedule. So I'll be getting done at like 7:30. It's going to be like I get home, I put James to bed, and then I get ready for my closeout. So I'm not going to really have time. But thanks everyone for coming out for the impromptu. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.